Hello, fiendlings. How the hell are you? Last week I mentioned that my new novel, An Ancient Trap, was available in ebook. Well, now it's also available as a trade paperback over at Amazon.com. I was asked when the audiobook will be ready, and I can only tell you that I'm recording it, and that while it's slow going, it is happening. So as long as my health holds out, I imagine we'll see it on the digital shelves come May at the latest. I should also be when the podcast presentation begins, if not sooner. For those of you that are purchasing copies of my work in any form, I thank you. You're helping keep the lights on and the podcast episodes coming. With that, it's time I got back in the recording chair. Be safe, have a great week, and we'll talk again real soon. Here's episode 19 of The Black, Arrival.
Chapter 8. They'd made it to the stairwell without incident, but they could still hear the creature tearing through the second floor. Kate wondered how long it would be before the thing figured out where they had gone. She hoped it would remain confused until they could get the hell out of the building. The new building was still under construction. The stairwell led down to an emergency exit that had already been blocked off. The door wasn't locked, but it barely budged against whatever the authorities had put in front of it. Again, there was no way out. Maeve held her arm at an odd angle. Jay stripped off the remains of his contamination suit. The crinkle of the fabric echoed in the concrete stairwell. Kate stared at him until he raised his eyebrows. "What?" he asked. She managed to grin. "I guess we don't need these after all." "Nope," he agreed. "Useless. M2 will eat right through it." "Maeve?" Her daughter looked at her. The girl's teeth were locked together in pain. "Would a sling help?" "Don't know," the girl said. Jay stared down at the remains of his suit and smiled. "Let's do something about that." The stairwell was silent except for the sounds of movement, sirens beyond the emergency exit, and their own breathing. Jay started to form a makeshift sling out of the suit. Kate stared at the door leading to the first floor interior. She blew out a sigh between her teeth. "Jay, I'm going to go scout the lab room, see if there's anything we can use." He shook his head. "Let me get Maeve situated first. You shouldn't be going in alone." "That's exactly why I'm going in alone. Take care of her." She tried to keep the fear from her voice, but knew she had failed. Kate stroked her daughter's undamaged arm. "I'll be right back." "No," Maeve said. "Don't go." Kate cleared her throat. "It's upstairs, and if something happens and we have to move, I can't carry you. But Uncle Jay can, right?" Jay nodded. He looked less than happy about the situation. "I can. I will. Just stay here until I come back. If that thing comes through the stairwell, get your asses into the lab area, okay?" "We will," Jay said. Kate bent down and kissed her daughter's cheek. She managed to smile. "I'll come back for you, I promise." "Isn't that what all the stupid white people say in horror movies?" Maeve asked. Kate giggled. "Don't worry, daughter of mine. I've seen them all." She turned from her two companions and faced the inner door. Kate took a deep breath and swiveled the handle. It moved easily beneath her hand. She pushed it open and headed inside. Darkness. Pure, uninterrupted darkness. No windows. No way for ambient light to even think about coming in. The door swung closed behind her with a bang. Kate jumped and then chuckled. She didn't know how it was even possible, but the first floor was somehow even darker. She pulled her phone from her pocket, turned on the flashlight mode, and swept the light in front of her. The floor was strewn with tools, sawhorses, stacks of sheetrock, metal supports, and bundles of wood. Just like the old building, the room had a wide hallway that faced the labs. Unlike the old building, there were 4 different lab areas instead of 2. The 2 new chem labs had already been piped. Drains leading God knows where sat in the middle of each room. The metal gleamed dimly in the wan light. The workers had yet to put up the glass enclosures or even put in the electrical cabling. She glanced around as she searched the floor. Debris crunched under her feet. "At least it hasn't been here," she said to herself, "or the floor would be completely clean." That was a good sign. Maybe M2 didn't know there was a first floor. A shiver ran up her spine. What if... She killed the thought as she raised her light to point at the ceiling. In the less than bright light coming from the phone, she could still see unfinished air ducts and pipes. "Fuck," she said to the empty room. Even at a whisper, her voice echoed off the concrete walls. It could get in here. It wouldn't have to bother with doors or stairs. If it found its way into an adjoining duct, it would just pour into the room. The thought of the black ooze raining down upon them made her sick to her stomach. She pointed the phone to the far wall. Was that what she thought it was? A tripod? Kate walked forward until the shape solidified. A grin spread across her face. A large rectangular light head stood atop the tripod. Light. The workers had to have light to work in here. She looked for a switch on the tripod, but didn't find one. Cursing, she followed the extension cord leading out of the light head. The cord led to a portable transformer against one of the walls. She knelt down and studied it. 4 red rocker switches stared back at her. She looked at the labels. One was marked Master, and it was in the off position. Kate took a deep breath and flicked it. The world exploded with light. She shut her eyes and waited for the retinal afterimage to fade. The room hummed with the buzz of electricity through the heavy halogens. When the afterimage dimmed, she slowly opened her eyes to slits. The incredibly large room was lit in each corner. The area for Chem Lab 1 was the brightest. The construction crew had put up several halogen tripods to illuminate plumbing and piping they were still connecting. She turned off her phone's flashlight mode and studied the ceiling. Ductwork stretched from the walls to the building interior. There were a number of exchanges leading upward. If the creature somehow entered the main vent, it could drop on them from anywhere. But if it tried to get to Chem Lab 1, it'd be burned alive. Kate grinned. That was the answer. They could sit in the middle of the lights and they'd be safe for as long as there was power and the lights didn't burn out. Best option, she thought. Kate turned and walked to the stairwell entrance. Just for giggles, she looked at her phone. No signal. Well, that was as expected. With the heavy stone walls, insulation, and half of the floor beneath the actual ground, cell phone reception would be shit. She already knew Mike had planned to put a repeater on the building. A little late now, she thought. If they stayed in here, they'd be safe, but cut off. No internet, no cell, nothing. But at least they'd have light. She knocked on the stairwell door. Jay? Maeve? Come on in. Someone murmured through the heavy metal door, and then the door handle turned. The image of a tentacle tearing open the door flashed in her mind. She knew it wasn't in the stairwell, but her heart was off to the races anyway. The door opened wide. Maeve stood next to Jay, her left arm wrapped and slung. Jay grinned at Kate. You like my ER skills? Kate sighed. Maeve? Is it better? The girl nodded but said nothing. She walked past her mother and into the room. Jay shrugged and followed her. Kate closed the door behind them and tested to make sure it would stay closed. She blew a sigh between her teeth and turned to watch Jay and her daughter. Jay studied the ceiling much as she had. Maeve walked directly to the intersection of light in the unfinished lab. Thuffer and thuckatash, Jay said. This is one big-ass room. Shut up, Sylvester, Maeve muttered. Jay made a farting noise with his lips. Kate, he pointed to the ceiling. Those ducts lead out and up, am I right? She nodded. I think so. If I remember correctly, they'll be positively pressurized, so air only goes out, not in. Right. Jay shook his head. Too damned bad all this isn't ready. But hey, he clapped his hands. At least we have light. Maeve put her back against the wall near the lights and slowly slid down. She used her good hand to steady herself, but still managed to make a dull thud when her ass touched the floor. She let out a small cry of pain. Kate looked at Jay. We need to see if we can find a medkit. They have to have one around here somewhere, don't they? Jay blinked. Only if you think illegal immigrant labor follows OSHA rules. She glared at him. Let's look anyway. He shrugged and moved off to the far wall. Kate watched him go and then headed to Maeve. She knelt next to her daughter. You going to be okay? Maeve's head rested against her chest. Really hurts. She looked up at her mother. Next time, get a babysitter. Kate's mouth opened and then closed. She giggled and stroked her daughter's hair. Stay still. I'll try and find something to make you more comfortable, okay? She rose to leave. Mom? Yeah, hun? Maeve stared at her with level eyes, but the girl's lower lip trembled. How long do we have light? As long as we have power, baby. And what if it decides we don't need power? Kate fought to keep her expression level, but the flesh on her arms prickled. It's not smart enough for that. Maeve sniffed back a tear. How do you know that? I don't. The words were out of her mouth before she thought about them. She shook her head. I don't, baby, but if it was that smart, I don't think we'd be standing here. Maeve put her head back on her chest. Kate watched her for a moment, and then began searching the unfinished labs. It took both Mike and Neil to get Bill through the doors and into the chair. He slumped in it like a tired kid, but his breathing was an old man's wheeze. Hoyt had managed to get herself into a chair. She stared at the wall as though it was something interesting. Neil was sure she was in shock. He didn't know what to do for her, or if there was anything that could be done. Mike stood next to the computer. When he cleared his throat, Neil looked at him, eyebrows raised. What? Can you get on this thing and see if we have network? Neil rolled his eyes. If the old knock was destroyed, I'm not sure we're going to have anything. Try. Mike's voice was a low growl. His expression was flat, but his eyes were full of panic and anger. Yes, sir, Neil said. He marched to the computer desk and brought up the interface. He typed in his username and password. The computer thought for a moment, and then a red dialog box appeared. He sighed. Can't authenticate. No network, boss. God damn it, Mike hissed. He slammed a fist down on the computer desk. The monitor jumped, and so did Neil. We have to... He stopped and then turned to Hoyt. Dr. Hoyt? The woman kept staring at the far wall. She hadn't even twitched at his words. Mike walked to her, placed a hand on her shoulder, and gently squeezed. Melanie? Hoyt blinked. Her head swiveled toward him as if it were on rusty hinges. She blinked again. Her eyes glittered a little. That was something. Do you still have communications with your people? My people? She asked in a dreamy, faraway voice. My people are dead, Mr. Beautry. Mike winced. Can you communicate with the CDC? Your radio? Radio. Dr. Hoyt stared down at the floor. Neil walked forward and knelt in front of her. Can I have your radio, Melanie? Hoyt raised her head and stared into his eyes. They won't talk to you. He forced a gentle smile. She was cracking up, but anything he could do to humor her might bring her out of her daze. He hoped. Maybe they will. I'd like to try. Okay. Dr. Hoyt pulled the radio from her belt and offered it. Control won't be happy. I'm sure they won't be, Neil agreed. But I will be, and I'm going to get us out of here. You are? She sighed and stared again at the floor. She finally spoke in a whisper. We are going to die here. The words hung in the air. Neil glanced up at Mike. His face was pale, but his eyes still glittered with energy. Mike nodded at the radio. Do it. Neil stared down at it. He turned the volume dial until he heard static and pressed the talk button. Control, this is Hal, over. The static continued. Beneath the layer of white noise, barely audible, excited voices wavered in and out. Neil blinked and tried again. Control, this is Hal quarantine area. We have an update on our situation. Over. He depressed the talk button. The room seemed to hold its breath. Hal, this is quarantine control outside building 2. What's your status? Over. Neil grinned at Mike. That was good. They were talking to the folks just outside the walls. 50 feet from where they sat was freedom. Now if only they could get there. This is Dr. Neil Illing from Hal. We are trapped in the lab on floor 1 of building 1. We need help. The creature is roaming freely through the building and there is no place to hide. Over. There was a pause. Neil's heart pounded in his chest. He was sure he heard Mike's doing the same. Dr. Illing? Where is Dr. Hoyt? Over. Neil took a deep breath. Dr. Hoyt is indisposed. She is unable to communicate at this time. Over. Another pause. The seconds dragged out like minutes. Neil suddenly wanted to scream at the radio. What was taking so goddamn long? Dr. Illing, we have the building surrounded. There is no way out, no way in. We cannot assist you until the biological entities are contained. Over. Finally, blessedly, he lost it. Are you fucking kidding me? He shouted into the radio. We have no weapons. We are unable to hide, let alone fight. At least give us some fucking weapons. Over. Pause. 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 Dr. Illing, your situation is understood. We cannot take the chance any of you are infected. Ben Taub is a war zone. The biological entity there has killed most of the hospital personnel and patients, as well as many military resources. We have it contained for the moment. We cannot risk another entity escaping. Over. The radio's plastic cover creaked beneath his grip. His white-knuckled fingers trembled. Control, have you tried halogen light? Anything besides bullets and bullshit? Pause. 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 Dr. Illing, can you update us on your entity? How large is it? What are its characteristics? Over. Neil felt like he was going to explode. He took in a deep breath to scream at the asshole on the other end of the radio, but stopped himself. He exhaled through his teeth and waited until he felt like he was in control of himself. Control. Our entity is large. It has consumed all the carpet, most of the sheetrock, and other non-metallic, non-glass materials. It has also killed at least 3 people, probably more. But we haven't seen it fully formed. It is large enough to easily fill a hallway. It sprouts tentacles and legs and is becoming increasingly fast. Over. Pause. Dr. Illing, do you have any samples of M2? Over. He glanced at the electron microscope. Mike, go over there and look through the eyepiece. You should see nothing but black with a blue glow around it. Mike rolled his eyes and did as he was told. He peered into the microscope. Neil, all I see is a glow. There's no black. Neil opened his mouth and then closed it. He turned his head and looked over at the SEM. Mike, step away from the scope. The boss stepped back. Where is it? Get out your flashlight, Neil hissed. Turn it on and pan the floor. Look for anything that gleams where it shouldn't. Dr. Illing, are you there? The voice said from the radio. Control, stand by, Neil said. Mike pulled the heavy safety light from his pocket and turned it on. The white light glared into the floor, easily visible against the fluorescent blue from the overheads. He stood next to the SEM and trained the light around the area. Focus on the sample container, Neil said. He couldn't keep his voice steady, and his heart thumped in his ears. If it had escaped the slide, where the hell did it go? Mike pointed at the SEM. Here? Neil nodded. Shit. Mike's light hit an impossibly clean, impossibly bright trail on the metal. He took another step away from the SEM as he followed the trail with his eyes. Dr. Illing, the radio squawked. He thumbed the speak button. Control, we have a sample loose in the lab. I think there's more in the chem lab's sample system. Plus whatever is left in the barrel. Over. Mike said. The trail just wraps around the machine. He killed the light and looked back at Neil. Where the hell did it go? Understood, Dr. Illing. Liger's encounters with the substance indicate it is highly flammable. If light doesn't fight it off, you may need to resort to more drastic measures. Over. Neil stared down at the radio. Fire. Light. Extreme heat. Maybe there was a way to fight this thing. Neil? Mike's shaky voice pulled him out of his thoughts. Mike's face was milk pale. Neil raised his eyebrows. The CEO pointed down at the floor. Neil followed his gaze. There. In the shadows beneath the microscope sat a tiny shape. Something amorphous. Something so dark it was like a hole into another universe. Neil tried to speak, but his voice came out in an unintelligible croak. He cleared his throat. Mike, get your flashlight back on. Yeah. Mike gulped and flicked the switch. He slowly trained the cone of white light toward the shadows. As the light chased away the darkness, the black shape twitched. When the halogen light came within a few centimeters, the shape trembled and slowly flowed backwards further into the shadows. Mike? Yeah, Neil? Blast it. Neil took a deep breath and was a little relieved to see Mike doing the same. Mike slowly lowered himself to his haunches. He flicked the off switch. The halogen's cone disappeared. He adjusted his aim and then flicked the switch. A bright white spot appeared in the middle of the amorphous shape. Bubbles burst across its surface, and the room filled with the crackle of green kindling. A sewer smell combined with burning rubber stung Neil's nostrils. The shape's edges split off from the burning center. Neil's mouth dropped open. 2 individual tendrils formed as their parent burned. Less than a few millimeters in size, they stayed in the shadows. The original, larger puddle had disappeared. The floor was scorched where it had been. "Mike?" "I see them," Mike said. He pointed the light at the larger of the 2 stragglers. It exploded in a puff of smoke and fire. He switched targets with the same result. 3 smudge marks were all that were left. "Dr. Illing!" The radio made them all jump. Neil thumbed the talk button without moving his eyes from the scorched floor. "Control, this is Illing. We have destroyed the sample loose in our lab. Over." Mike kept his light focused on the floor. He seemed to be in a trance. "Mike?" The man turned to him. A little color was slowly coming back into his cheeks, but he still looked on the verge of passing out. "You okay?" Mike nodded. "Yeah, I mean..." "Dr. Illing, are there any other samples loose? Over." He shook his head and then winced. It wasn't like they could see him. "No, Control, nothing else loose. We have the large entity roaming the building, the sealed barrel, and whatever is in the dispensing system. Over." Mike blew out a sigh and then chuckled. "We need to just set fire to the whole goddamn place." Neil cocked an eyebrow. "I'd say that's a last resort." He pointed to the secure area behind the labs. "There's enough flammable chemicals back there to blow a hole in the goddamned universe." Mike nodded. "I know. That was the point." "Dr. Illing, is there any way to secure the barrel? Over." Neil opened his mouth and then closed it. What the hell is he talking about? Mike shrugged and looked at Hoyt. The CDC doc was staring at the floor as if nothing had happened. Neil wasn't even sure she was breathing. "Dr. Hoyt," Mike said. She didn't look up. Mike walked toward her and tapped her shoulder. She flinched, but did not break her stare with the tile. "Dr. Hoyt." "Melanie?" It was the first name that seemed to snap her out of it. At least a little. She slowly raised her head and met his eyes. "What?" "What do they mean by secure?" Mike asked. She shivered. "Sample. Any virulent pathogen samples have to be collected." Mike looked at Neil. "You tell them to fuck right off." Neil nodded. "Control, there is no way to secure the barrel, the lab, or anything else. The M2 entity roaming the building can come back here at any time. Over." "Dr. Illing, it is imperative we have samples to study. Please find a way to protect the barrel and whatever remains in the dispensing system. Over." "Fuck you," Mike growled. Neil clicked the talk button again. "Are you out of your mind? This stuff destroys damn near everything it touches. You can't take it out of here." "Dr. Illing, if you do your job, we'll get you out of there. Over." "Job." Mike spat out the word with a stream of saliva. "Control, get us out of here. Now, and you can have your damned sample." Pause. "Control?" No response. Neil looked at Mike. "You're right. We have to blow this place. They're going to let us die in here anyway, and we can't let that shit out in the world." Mike turned toward the chem lab, and Neil followed his gaze. The room was a wreck of smashed equipment. When the M2 had escaped into the ceiling, it had left the place a ruin. "You know how to run the dispenser?" Mike asked. Neil nodded, although his boss wasn't looking at him. "I do, yeah." Mike turned to him. "Then let's figure out how to torch this place. If nothing else, it'll keep the big beastie upstairs from coming down here. I hope." "That's going to be tough," Neil said. "We have Halon systems in both labs as well as the secure area. They'll put out a fire in no time." Mike grinned. "Then I guess we'll have to get creative." He looked at Bill. The older scientist was still slumped in his chair, a look of pain on his face. "Still with us, Bill?" He raised his head and winked at Mike. "I ain't dead yet." The words came out in a huff of air. Neil put a hand on his friend's shoulder. "All right, Bill. Let's start brainstorming."